Why do you carry such a heavy burden? Many years ago, I found myself trapped in a vague, persistent sense of exhaustion. That exhaustion wasn't caused by working late or pulling all nighters. It was a mental deficit, a feeling that I couldn't keep up. I realized I was living in an intricate cage made of expectations. I was afraid of disappointing my parents, afraid my colleagues would find me difficult to get along with, afraid my views on social media wouldn't be liked, and even afraid to turn down a street vendor. At that time, I asked myself a very absurd question. If everything falls and left in the world, does it still feel this anxious? The answer, surprisingly, was not at all. In that moment, I realized that all my suffering actually pointed to one ultimate truth. I had no freedom. It was during that phase, to be honest, the first time I read it, I wasn't healed. I was offended. Everything since who look felt like a cold scalpel cutting through the excuses I'd clung to for survival without a word of warning. It told me, your misfortune is your own choice. I almost threw the book across the room. I thought, how can this person be so harsh to a defenseless sufferer? But as I pushed through that discomfort and read on, by the third time I'd read it, I felt a spine, chilling clarity. Today I want to share this book with you, not merely as a summary of knowledge, but as a personal confession of how I reshaped my worldview. We won't focus on practical tips. We'll focus on core principles. We don't seek comfort. We seek the truth. At the core of this book lies Adlerian psychology, and the first cornerstone of Adlerian psychology is the rejection of the law of causality we've come to take for granted. Freudian psychology tells us, your current personality and struggles stem from childhood trauma and your parents' parenting style. This is called determinism. We're all, to some extent, adherents of this view because it's so convenient. When I suffer from social anxiety, I can blame my overbearing mother. When I fail in my career, I can blame the rigidity of social class. There is no such thing as psychological trauma. This is precisely what initially made me angry. Does that mean the suffering of those who have endured bullying or domestic violence is all a lie? Here, I'd like to pause and share a few more thoughts on my perspective. Adler isn't denying the reality of suffering, he's denying its determining power. He introduced a concept called teleology. He believed that we don't end up in our current state because of some past cause, but rather that we fabricate or exploit past experiences to achieve a specific purpose in the present. For example, the book mentions a young man who locked himself in his room for years, too afraid to go out, claiming it was because of past trauma. Adler, however, argues that he created anxiety and fear specifically to achieve the goal of staying indoors. Because as long as he didn't go out, he could continue to receive his parents' attention. And in that small room, he didn't have to face anyone's judgment. He was safe. When I read this, I felt a sense of exposure that was almost cruel. I thought of myself. There was a time when I always believed I was introverted and incapable of handling. I had always assumed this was some kind of innate character flaw. But after reading this book, I began to reflect. Wasn't I deliberately labeling myself as introverted to avoid the humiliation of potential failure? Because as long as I convinced myself I was introverted, I had the perfect excuse not to take on challenges or make mistakes. If we take this logic to its extreme, we'll discover a terrifying truth. Humans often subconsciously choose unhappiness, because for us, unhappiness is also a form of protection. Change is painful, and while staying the same may not be comfortable, it is at least familiar. We're accustomed to wallowing in the familiar quagmire, and are reluctant to venture into the unknown wilderness. Adler calls this attachment to the status quo a weakness stemming from a lack of courage to change. So regarding Chapter 1, the key insight I most want to share with you is this. Life is not a straight line extending from the past into the future, but a series of isolated points. The present moment is the very source that gives. The backdrop of your past depends on the kind of life you want to live now. What matters is not what you've been given, but how you use what you've been given. The texture of life does not depend on the quality of the fabric, but on your skill as a tailor. If we resolve the issue of the pasts, yet still feel unhappy, it is because we are living in the illusion of comparison. If there were no other people, if you were the only person in the universe, then loneliness, inferiority, competition, and humiliation would all vanish. Personally, I don't fully agree with this extreme view. I believe people would still have a fear of death and a reverence for the unknown. But when it comes to the bitterness of everyday life, Adler has indeed hit the nail on the head. Why do we feel inferior? Adler believed that inferiority itself isn't a bad thing. It's a driving force behind the pursuit of superiority. The trouble lies in the fact that we've turned this pursuit into competition with others. In this era of social media explosion, this sense of competition has been infinitely amplified. When you scroll through your social feed and see an old classmate buying a luxury home or a peer achieving financial freedom, you feel a pang of pain. Why? Because in your logic, life is a racetrack. If they're ahead, it means you're falling behind. Here, I'd like to share a recent realization of mine. I've discovered that for many of us, so-called effort isn't about self-actualization. It's about playing a ranking game. The underlying tone of this competitive dynamic is adversarial. If you view everyone around you as a competitor, you'll never find true happiness. Because as long as there's one person better than you, you're a loser. Adler proposed a fascinating concept. Everyone is my partner. It sounds like naive self-help fluff, doesn't it? But logically, it holds true. If we aren't competing on the same track but walking our own paths across a vast wilderness, then, even though our paces vary and our heights differ, there are no winners or losers. We are simply walking together. When I tried to put this idea into practice in my life, I found that the tension dissolved. I began to genuinely rejoice in others' successes. The former sense of scarcity, where if he's doing well, I must be falling short, was gradually replaced by a sense of expansiveness. We are all pushing the boundaries of human life. But this is hard, really hard, because it requires us to let go of the struggle for power. In a relationship, we always want to prove that I'm right and you're wrong. Even during arguments, we insist that the other person back down and apologize. Adler reminds us, when you try to prove yourself right through an argument, you've already fallen into the trap of competition and power. The logical loop closes here. If you still need to be right to overpower others, it means you're still living in fear of them. A truly confident person does not need to prove themselves by defeating others. Healthy self-doubt does not stem from comparing oneself to others, but from comparing oneself to one's ideal self. If this book were to leave us with just one concept, it would undoubtedly be separation of concerns. This is the most practical, and also the most cold part of the entire book. It is also the ultimate solution to the lack of freedom we mentioned at the beginning. Adler said. We live in exhaustion because we are constantly interfering with others' issues, or because our own issues are constantly being interfered with by others. So how do we distinguish between what is your issue and what is mine? It's simple. Look at who ultimately bears the consequences of the action. For example, studying is the child's issue, while forcing a child to study is the parent interfering with the child's issue. Another example. How everything you is my responsibility, but everything falls apart of my evaluation. That means you are interfering with my responsibility while also linking your own responsibility to my evaluation. When I read this, it truly felt like a revelation. Think about it. Do you often worry about things like, I'm so good to him. Why doesn't he appreciate it? I sent this message. Why hasn't he replied yet? If you understand the concept of separating responsibilities, you'll realize being kind to others is your responsibility. Whether they appreciate it or not is theirs. You can't control it, and you shouldn't worry. Doesn't this sound a bit like the cold-hearted saying, Adlerian should mind their own business? Actually, it doesn't. Adler isn't telling you not to care about others. He's telling you to let go of that desire to control. My favorite metaphor in the book is, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. In relationships, interfering with someone else's issues is actually an extremely arrogant act. You may think you're doing it for their benefit, but fundamentally, you're trying to reshape them to gain your own sense of accomplishment or security. One detail that struck me the most is about the desire for recognition. We all crave recognition from others. Yet Adler states unequivocally, do not live to meet the expectations of others. He believes that seeking recognition is, at its core, seeking a reward. If you do things solely to earn praise from others, you are accepting a form of servitude. Once that praise disappears, so does your motivation. Here's a point I'd like to discuss with everyone. Can we really not care at all about what others think? Adler's logic, taken to its extreme, goes like this. If you aren't disliked by certain people, you cannot achieve true freedom. Because not being disliked means you must smooth out your rough edges in every relationship and cater to everyone's preferences. If you spend your entire life scrambling to not be disliked, then you are actually living out someone else's script. Being disliked is actually a sign that you are exercising your right to freedom. It shows that you have established your own boundaries. It shows that you are no longer a lump of putty to be molded at will, but an independent, whole, and substantial soul. Freedom means being disliked by others. If you don't feel disliked, it means you haven't yet begun to live a truly free life. Out to this point, some might think, Adlerian psychology is too lonely. The past doesn't matter. Others have nothing to do with me. I only pursue my own freedom. Isn't this a form of extreme individualism? If it stopped there, Adler wouldn't be a master of his generation. After the cold surgery of separation of issues, he prescribed a warm remedy, sense of community. He said that although we must separate issues, our ultimate goal is to integrate ourselves into a larger community. This integration is not achieved through pleasing others, but through contribution. Here, Adler proposes the sole measure of happiness, the sense of contribution. Note that it is not contribution itself, but the sense of contribution. This is yet another counterintuitive perspective. Adler believed that as long as a person subjectively feels, I am useful to others, they are valuable, and they are happy. There's a particularly thought-provoking detail here. Adler gives an example. How can an elderly person who has lost the ability to work and is bedridden gain a sense of contribution? After all, Adler says, as long as they exist, they are a contribution to their loved ones. Their very existence maintains the integrity of the family. This logic breaks free from the trap of utilitarianism. We're too accustomed to evaluating people based on their social function. How much money do you have? How much value do you generate? But Adler says we should evaluate people from the perspective of existence. I'd like to pause here and elaborate a bit. This sense of contribution doesn't require validation from others. As long as I'm convinced in my heart that my current actions benefit a community, I am free and happy. For example, as I make this video right now, if I'm solely focused on how many likes I'll get or how many donations I'll receive, I'm seeking validation, and I'm a slave, not a free person. But if, in this very moment, I simply feel, purely and simply, that the thoughts I'm sharing might resonate with even a single soul on the other side of the screen, even for just a minute, this subjective sense of contribution alone completes my circle of happiness. This is Adler's ultimate transcendence of loneliness. We gain an independent will through the separation of concerns, and through subjective contribution, we re-establish a connection with the world. This connection is not a chain, but the gravitational pull between stars. As long as we have the subjective feeling that I am useful to others, we can accept our imperfect selves and gain the courage to keep living. As we approach the conclusion, we must return to a fundamental question. Since the future is unknown and the past is irrelevant, how exactly should we live this life? Adler offers an exquisitely beautiful metaphor. Life is not a mountain climb. If life were a mountain climb, then every moment before reaching the summit would be, on the way, a state of incompletion. What if you encounter an accident along the way and fail to reach the summit? Wouldn't your entire life then become a tragic failure? Adler believed that life is not linear, but a succession of moments. Life is a dance. In dance, the act of dancing itself is the purpose. You don't need to dance in order to reach some endpoint. Every moment you are dancing is complete in itself. When I read this, I felt a tremendous sense of relief. The underlying tone of our era is anxiety, because we are always living for some moment in the future. We work hard in elementary school for the sake of middle school, in middle school for the sake of college, in college for the sake of finding a job, and in finding a job for the sake of retirement. We are forever living in a preparatory phase. Yet we never live in the here and now. If you view life as a dance, then, even if today you simply shared a good cup of coffee with a friend, that is complete. Even if today you simply read a moving sentence, that is fulfillment. Even if you are sitting here right now, pondering these abstract philosophical propositions, that in itself is the highest fulfillment of your life. Here, I'd like to share a perspective that many of you may not have considered. Many people think Adler is teaching us to be Buddhist, style detached and unconcerned. But I believe Adler is actually teaching us a form of ultimate positivity. When you stop dwelling on the past, which you cannot change, and stop fantasizing about the future, which has not yet arrived, the only battlefield left before you is the here and now. On this battlefield, you hold absolute sovereignty. Adler called this state a life of reality. The greatest lie in life, dwelling on the past and pinning hopes on the future, how everything falls apart. Ways of evading the responsibilities of the present. This is the spiritual awakening that faith, the courage to be disliked, faith has given me. This book doesn't actually teach you any practical skills. It does just one thing. It puts the power of Adlerian psychology is also known as the psychology of courage. Why courage? Because it takes courage to admit that misfortune is a choice I've made. It takes courage to admit that how others see me is their business. And letting go of the craving for validation to pursue that solitary freedom requires a resolve bordering on reckless courage. But I believe that behind this courage lies an elevation in the quality of life. When you stop trying to please the whole world, you'll find your world has shrunk, yet it has also deepened. What remains are those connections that are truly worth your investment. Connections free from competition. What you see is a self that, though imperfect, is full of possibilities. At the end of this video, I don't want to summarize the entire book. Instead, I'd like to leave an open-ended, slightly challenging question for each of you watching. If, starting this very minute, you decided to stop seeking anyone's approval and stop explaining away anyone's misunderstandings, what kind of collapse would occur in your life? And on the ruins of that collapse, what kind of flowers do you think would? I'm still practicing this kind of courage myself. Sometimes I do well, and other times I find my heart breaking late at night because of someone's cold words. But I know that the path toward freedom is the right one. Evolution is a painful process. Beyond the boundaries of our understanding lies a wilderness. But I hope that in this very moment, in this wilderness,